Okay, chapter 210, Halford's Studies. It was midnight. In a garret belonging to a house in the same court where Cranky Jem resided sat Henry Halford. He was alone. His elbow rested on the table and his hand supported his feverish head, for dark thoughts filled the brain of that young man. The flickering light of a single candle held upon the pages of an old volume which he was reading with intense interest. His cheeks were pale, his lips were dry, his throat was parched, and his eyeballs glared with unnatural luster. He did not feel a thirst, else there was water handy to assuage the cravings. Nor did he hear his heart beating violently, nor experience the feverish and rapid throbbing of his temples. No, his whole thoughts, his entire feelings, his every sensation, all were absorbed in the subject of his study, and that the reader may fully comprehend the nature of those impulses which were now urging this strange young man on the perpetration of a deed that was destined to give a terrible celebrity to his name, we must quote the passage on which his mind was so intently fixed. The assassination of Gustavus III of Sweden. The nobles were discontented with the general conduct of the king, and a conspiracy was planned against him under his own roof. His wars had compelled him to negotiate large loans and to impose upon his subjects heavy taxes. The nobles took advantage of that circumstance to prejudice the minds of many of the people against the sovereign who had labored so long for their real good. On the 16th of March, 1792, he received an anonymous letter, warning him of his immediate danger from a plot that was laid to take away his life, requesting him to remain at home and avoid balls for a year, and assuring him that if he should go to the masquerade for which he was preparing, he would be assassinated that very night. The king read the note with contempt, and at a late hour entered the ballroom. After some time he sat down in a box with the Count of Essen, and observed that he was not deceived in his contempt for the letter, since, had there been any design against his life, no time could be more favorable than that moment. He then mingled without apprehension among the crowd, and just as he was preparing to retire with the Prussian ambassador, he was surrounded by several persons in masks, one of whom fired a pistol at the back of the king and lodged the contents in his body. A scene of dreadful confusion ensued. The conspirators, amidst the general tumult and alarm, had time to retire to other parts of the room, but one of them had previously dropped his pistols and a dagger close by the wounded king. A general order was given to all the company to unmask, and the doors were immediately closed, but no person appeared with any particular distinguishing marks of guilt. The king was immediately conveyed to his apartment, and the surgeon, after extracting a ball and some slugs, gave favorable hopes of his majesty's recovery. Suspicions immediately fell upon such of the nobles as had been notorious for their opposition to the measures of the court. The anonymous letter was traced up to Colonel Lillehorn, major in the king's guards, and he was immediately apprehended. But the most successful clue that seemed to offer was in consequence of the weapons which had fallen from the assassin. An order was issued directing all the armorers, gunsmiths, and cutlers in Stockholm to give every information in their power to the officers of justice concerning the weapons. A gunsmith who had repaired the pistols readily recognized them to be the same which he had repaired some time since for a nobleman of the name Ankarström, a captain in the army, and the cutler who had made the dagger referred at once to the same person. The king languished from the 17th to the 29th of March. At first, the reports of his medical attendance were favorable, but on the 28th, the mortification was found to have taken place, which terminated his existence in a few hours. On opening his body, a square piece of lead and 2 rusty nails were found unextracted within the ribs. During his illness, and particularly after he was made acquainted with the certainty of his approaching dissolution, Gustavus continued to display that unshaken courage which he had manifested on every occasion during his life. A few hours before his decease, he made some alterations in the arrangement of public affairs. He had before, by his will, appointed a council of regency, but convinced by recent experience that how little he could depend on the attachment of his nobles, and being also aware of the necessity of a strong government in difficult times, he appointed his brother, the Duke of Sundermania, sole regent, till his son, who was then about 14, should have attained the age of 18 years. His last words were a declaration of pardon to the conspirators against his life. The actual murderer alone was expected, and he was... The actual murderer alone was accepted, and he was accepted only at the strong insistence of the regent. And accepted, not accepted. Those two sound the same when you speak them with an American accent. So left out. So he didn't pardon the person who actually shot him, but he pardoned everyone else. And those who surrounded his majesty in his dying moments. Immediately on the death of the king, the young prince was proclaimed by the title of Gustavus IV. Oh, I thought we were already doing Gustavus IV. No, it's the third. Okay. My brain's not keeping up with the story today. Okay. Ankarstrom was no sooner apprehended than he confessed with an air of triumph that he was the person who had endeavored to liberate his country from a monster and a tyrant. Suspicions at the same time fell on the Counts Horn and Ribbing, Baron Petchlin, Baron Ehrensvard, Baron Hartsmandorf, von Angerstrom, the royal secretary, and others. And these suspicions were confirmed by the confession of Ankerstrom. After a very fair and ample trial, this man was condemned to be publicly and severely whipped on 3 successive days, his right hand and his head to be cut off, and his body impaled, which sentence he suffered on the 17th of May. His property was given to his children, who, however, were compelled to change their name. Ankerstrom was a martyr, a hero, exclaimed Halford aloud, his imagination excited by the preceding narrative and all the morbid feelings of his wrongly biased mind aroused at the idea of the terrible renown that attached itself to the name of regicide. Then, although the garret in which he sat was so cold that ice floated on the water in the pitcher, and the nipping chill of a February night came through the cracked panes and ill-closed lattice, while the snow lay thick upon the slanting tiles immediately above his head, that young man's entire frame glowed with a feverish heat, which shone with sinister luster in his eyes, and appeared in the 2 deep red, hectic spots which marked his cheeks. Yes, Ankerstrom was a hero, he exclaimed. Oh, how he must have despised the efforts of the torturers to wring from him a groan, how he must have scorned the array of penalties which were sought to be made so terrible. And Ravaillac, the regicide beneath whose hands Henry IV of France, oh, how well is every word of his history treasured up in my mind. But Francis Damien, his fate was terrible indeed, and yet I am not afraid to contemplate it, even though such a one should be in store for me. Then hastily turning to the History of France in the volume which he was reading, he slowly and in measured terms read the passage regarding the attempted assassination of Louis XV of France. Halford, upon completing the passage, pushed the book from him. He must have had a great and powerful mind to have dared to attempt to kill a king, and his name is remembered in history. Ah, that thought must have consoled him in the midst of those infernal torments. What is more delightful than the conviction of emerging from vile obscurity and creating a reputation? Although one so tarnished and disfigured that the world shrinks from it with loathing, yes, better to be a Turpin or a Barrington, a Claude Duval or a Jack Sheppard than live unknown and die without exciting a sensation. But it would be glorious, oh, how glorious to be ranked with Ankerstrom, Ravaillac, Damien, Felt, Guy Fawkes, Fieschi, and the gallant few who have either slain or attempted the lives of monarchs or great men. I am miserable, poor, obscure, and without a hope of rising by legitimate means. I have seen the inside of a palace and am doomed to drag on my wretched existence in this garret. I have partaken of the dainties that came from the table of a sovereign, and were I hungry now, a sorry crust is all that my cupboard could afford. I have listened to the musical voice of that high-born lady whose name I scarcely dare to breathe even to myself. And now the cold blast of February comes with its hoarse sound to grate upon my ears in this miserable, miserable garret. Oh, why was my destiny cast in so low a sphere? What has been my almost constant occupation, with some few brighter intervals since I was 12 years old? A potboy, a low, degraded potboy. The servant of servants, the slave of slaves, forced to come and go at the beck and call of the veriest street sweeper that frequented the tap room. Ah, when I think of all this humiliation, I feel that my blood boils even upon my very brain. My eyes and cheeks appear to be on fire. I seem as if my senses were leaving me. And as he spoke, he clenched his fists and ground his teeth together with a ferocious bitterness which indicated the fearfully morbid condition of his mind. For he was enraged against fortune, who had made him poor and humble, against the world for keeping him so, and against royalty and aristocracy for being so much happier and so comparably more blessed than the section of society to which he belonged. And in his vanity, for his soaring disposition made him vain, he conceived that he possessed elements of greatness, which the world, with a wilful blindness, would not see, or which adverse circumstances would not suffer to develop themselves. He deemed himself more persecuted than others moving in the same sphere. His restless, diseased, and excited mind had conjured up 1,000 evils to which he thought himself the marked, the special prey. He had seen in his visits to the palace so much of the highest eminence of luxury, pleasure, happiness, and indolent enjoyment, that he looked around with horror and affright when he found himself hurled back again in the lowest depths of obscurity, privation, and cheerlessness of life. He had at intervals feasted his eyes so greedily with all the fascination, the glitter, the gorgeousness, the splendor, the ease, and the voluptuousness of the court, that he could not endure the contemplation of that fearful contrast which was afforded by the everyday and familiar scenes of starvation, penury, misery, and ineffectual toil that marked the existence of the people. The moral condition of Henry Halford was a striking proof of the daring flights of which the human mind is capable. On the very first occasion of his visit to the palace, he had allowed himself to be carried away by the wildest emotions and strangest impressions that were produced by the novelty of what he then saw and heard. Royalty had been ever associated in his vulgar conception with something grand and handsome in man and something wonderfully beautiful in woman. Thus, when he first saw the Queen, he was prepared to admire her. He admired her accordingly, and that feeling increased to a degree the insolence of which at times overawed and terrified even himself. By another wayward inclination of his unhealthy but enthusiastic mind, he had from the first been prepared to dislike the prince, and this feeling increased in violence with those circumstances which each successive visit to the royal abode developed. At length, as if his destiny must infallibly hurry him on to some appalling catastrophe, he was discovered by the prince in the detestable condition of an eavesdropper, and was ignominiously driven forth from the dwelling where his mind had gradually collected the elements of a most unnatural excitement. He knew that any attempt to repeat his visits would be frustrated by the precautions which were certain to have been adopted to prevent future intrusions of a like nature, and he now felt precisely as one who is compelled suddenly to abandon a habit to which he had been wedded. Strange as it may appear, the morbid excitement attendant upon those visits to the palace was as necessary to Halford's mental happiness as tobacco, opium, snuff, or strong liquors are to so many millions of individuals. With a person in such a state of mind, the first impulse was bitter hatred against the one who had deprived him of the source of pleasurable excitement. And in that vengeful feeling were absorbed all those rational reflections which would have convinced him that his own insolent intrusion, his own unpardonable conduct, had provoked the treatment he had received. He never paused to ask himself by what right he had entered the palace and played the ignoble part of listener to private conversation and a spy upon the hallowed sanctity of domestic life. The dominant idea in his mind was his ignominious expulsion. Fate has now filled my cup of bitterness to the brim, he would say to himself, and all that remains for me to do is to avenge myself on him whom my destiny has made the instrument of this crowning degradation. By degrees, the mind of that young man found its gloomy broodings upon vengeance associating themselves with other sentiments. He gradually blended this idea of revenge with the ardent desire of breaking those trammels which kept his name imprisoned in the silent cavern of obscurity. The two sentiments at length united in his imagination, and his pulse beat quickly, and his eyes flashed fire when he surveyed the possibility of gratifying his thirst for vengeance, and suddenly rendering his name notorious at the same moment, and by one desperate, fearful deed. The reader cannot now be at a loss to comprehend how this wretchedly mistaken young man was brought to study the history of those regicides who have gained an infamous renown in the annals of nations. And as he dwelt with an insane enthusiasm upon those narratives, the feeling of admiration, nay, adoration, which he had once experienced toward the Queen was merged in the terrible longing for a diabolical notoriety that now became his predominating and all-absorbing passion. I think he's going to try and kill them. Whether just the Queen or just the Prince or both, I don't know. But this isn't good. Yes, he exclaimed as he pushed the book away from him. I will be talked about. My name shall be upon every tongue. Obscurity shall no longer enshroud me. Its darkness is painful to my soul. I will do a deed that shall make the kingdom ring from one end to the other with the astounding tidings. The newspapers shall struggle with all the eagerness of competition to glean the most trivial facts concerning me. And when the day arrives for me to appear before my judges, the great nobles and the high-born ladies of England shall crowd in the tribunal to witness the trial of the potboy, Henry Halford. The act on which the young man was now resolved appeared not to him in its real light as an atrocious crime, a deed that would arouse a yell of execration from one end of the land to the other. It seemed, on the contrary, a glorious achievement of which he would have reason to be proud. Alas, how strangely constituted is the human mind, which, in any state of being, could cherish such monstrous delusions, such fatal aspirations. But there is no blame to be attached to society for this development. But is there no blame to be attached to society for this development of ideas so morbid, even on the part of one single individual? Is there nothing in the constitution of that society which gives encouragement, as it were, to those detestable sentiments? Let us see. Enough has been said in the more serious and reasoning parts of this work to prove that society is in a vitiated, a false, and an artificial condition. The poor are too poor, and the rich too rich. The obscure are too low, and the exalted too high. The upper classes alone have opportunities for signalizing themselves. The industrious millions have no chance of rising in the state. Interest procures rank in the Navy, money buys promotion in the Army, and interest and money united obtain seats in the Legislative Assembly. Interest and money, then, remain to the exclusive few. The millions have neither, nor are they even stimulated by a national system of education. At this time, England did not have education for all. They would later, I actually have a book I wrote about the institution of the laws that required that education be offered to all, regardless of station, but at this time they didn't. And it had been pushed for quite a while, the need for education, even for the poor in England. Before then, it was felt that education belonged to those who could afford to pay for it, or whose children didn't have to work because their family needed them to. So that's what they're talking about. They're like, look, if we don't even educate the people in our country, then how can we blame them for not having the opportunities that would help to raise them out of poverty? So that's what they're talking about there. That does come later, but not for another almost 30 years. An aristocrat of common abilities may rise to eminence in some department of state, but with little trouble. But a son of toil, however vast his natural talents, has not a single chance of starting from obscurity through the medium of their proper development. This is true, and we defy the most subtle reasoner on behalf of the oligarchy to refute these positions. Now, such being the case, with the dominant aristocracy on one hand and the oppressed millions on the other, is it not evident that every now and then some member of the latter class will brood upon the astounding contrast, until feelings of a deplorably morbid nature become excited in his mind? How could it be otherwise? Ireland, with its agrarian outrages and its frequent instances of assassination, proves the fact. England, with its incendiary fires and periods of deep distress, affords additional corroboration. We deplore that such should be the case, and not for a moment do we advocate such means of vindicating just rights against the usurpers thereof. So they're saying, yeah, we can understand where this comes from, right? I mean, if we look at the situation that we've created in our society, it makes sense that every once in a while, the absolute hopelessness of the situation in which so many people are born and cannot escape might lead someone to do something awful. And the writers of this are saying, we're not, advocating or applauding or saying that it's okay that those things happen. But if we know some of the roots of where they're coming from, maybe we can do something about it. But if these instances of outbreaking revenge, if these ebullitions of indomitable resentment do now and then occur, no small portion of the blame must be charged against that aristocracy which maintains itself on an eminence so immeasurably above the depths in which the masses are compelled to languish. And when the poor creature who is goaded to desperation does strike, can we wonder if, in the madness of his rage, he deals his blows indiscriminately or against an innocent person? He may even aim at royalty itself, although in every really constitutional country, the sovereign is little more than a mere puppet, the prime minister of the day being the virtual ruler of the nation. From what we have said, it is easy to perceive how the contemplation of the splendid luxury of the palace first unhinged and unsettled the mind of Henry Holford. We must now go a step farther. Society manifests a most inordinate and pernicious curiosity in respect to criminals who perpetrate an unusual offense. This curiosity passes all legitimate bounds. The newspapers, with a natural attention to pecuniary interests, obey the cravings of that feeling by serving up the most highly seasoned food to suit the particular appetite. Portraits of the guilty one are exhibited in every picture shop. Opposite Allusions are introduced into dramatic representations, and even the presiding genius of a Punch and Judy show mingles the subject with his humorous outpourings. If the criminal make an attack upon royalty, he goes through the important but mysterious ordeal of an examination at the Home Office, whence the reporters for the press are excluded. On his appearance at Bow Street, the magisterial tribunal is crowded with gentlemen and ladies who were accommodated with seats upon the bench, as the journal says. And when the finale comes at the Central Criminal Court, the fees for admission to the gallery rise to 2 or 3 guineas for each individual. Thus, the criminal is made into a hero. Now, is not all this sufficient to turn the head of one whose mind is already partially struggling? Society, then, is to blame in many ways for the development of those morbid feelings which, in the present instance, actuated Henry Halford in his desperate purpose. Okay, so it sounds like Henry Halford is going to try and kill either the Queen or the Prince or both. And he must not succeed because we know history. But I don't know, we'll see what happens.